Shalom, shalom, everybody. Welcome back to a new week. It should be a good, safe, and healthy week for everybody. And we are back with a new week and a new episode for the Pulse of Israel here in our eternal and ancestral homeland, the Judean hills here in the land of Israel. Today, I am back with Martin Sherman. Martin is the director of the Israel Institute for Strategic Studies. And today we are talking about his latest article about Naftali Bennett and the new Israeli government. So let's bring in Martin Sherman. Shalom,
Hi.
Martin.
Hi, shalom to you and all the viewers.
How are you today?
Well, I'm okay. Still rather apprehensive about what's going to happen on the political scene, but I suppose we have to hope for the best.
I'm with you 100%. And let's start by bringing up actually some of the quotes from Naftali Bennett that you start with in your article. And again, I'm quoting, this is a tweet of Naftali Bennett, Prime Minister Naftali Bennett back in 2020. Boogie Ya'alon, Benny Gantz, and Yvette Lieberman are knowingly endangering the security of Israeli citizens. As Israel's defense minister, Naftali Bennett was Israel's defense minister at the time of this tweet, I declare an Israeli government that is dependent on the support of the Joint Arab Party and is extorted by supporters of terrorism, is tangibly and immediately placing the lives of Israeli citizens and IDF soldiers in peril. And again, today, Naftali Bennett is prime minister, and he is in a position where not only the Joint Arab Party, which is not part of the government, is extorting them because he needs their votes, but the Muslim Brotherhood Ram Party is part of his government extorting him because he needs their votes. And then the second quote you bring from Naftali Bennett, this is back in 2021, Ram is a sister movement, that's the political party, is a sister movement of Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood. This is an extremist and anti-Zionist faction with no place in the Israeli Knesset at all. Yamina will not be complicit in forming a government dependent on Ram, not with its support, not with its abstention, and not in any way. And then he goes on to call out Netanyahu because he was in talks with that party to somehow make a deal with them. And again, here we are in today's situation where his government not only talked with him, but is part of his government, and he's being extorted each and every day on Israeli security issues in order to ensure that that Muslim Brotherhood party stays in his government. Why are you apprehensive, Martin?
Well, precisely for the reasons that Naftali Bennett himself gave. You know, what you're seeing here is basically Bennett, in a single act of deceit and duplicity, has given the left wing exactly what they wanted, been precluded from for many years: broad access to positions of government power and influence. And this, of course, is completely against the public will, because if you look at the elections, putting the animosity, personal animosity to Netanyahu aside, the elections show quite clearly that there is a very substantial majority in favor of right-of-center parties and a clear public wish to preclude left-wing parties from positions of government control and influence. So this basically is not only an act of clear deceit and duplicity, but a great deformation and distortion of the democratic process in Israel. It seems to me that the government reminds me of a bunch of kids who suddenly found some stolen candy, and now they're wondering how best to divvy it up. I think it's a very sad time for the Israeli public, because I'm open to the claim that after over a decade in power, there might be time for a change. But of course, Netanyahu's great advantage has always been the alternative. And there's been no alternative with any electoral backing that could replace him. His nearest rival, Yair Lapid, who for some reason is popular with the electorate, something I personally cannot understand. But Yair Lapid got roughly half of what Netanyahu got. You now have in power as prime minister someone who got about 1/5 support of the electorate, and the most popular candidate by far, head of the biggest party by far, is ostracized. This is clearly a huge distortion of the democratic process.
So there's a few things to break down here. So let's start with the first one in terms of the democratic process, because some people say, wait a second, this is parliamentary coalition politics. Everything's democratic. And in terms of Naftali Bennett going against his voting base, well, he told the voters, while on the one hand he won't sit with Lapid and he won't sit with the Meretz and he won't sit with the Arab parties, he also said he will do everything to ensure there isn't a fifth elections. And he explained, well, since I have to make something true, and since the most important thing is not allowing fifth elections, it's democratic, and I was on board with my voters that's what I was going to do. How do you respond to that?
Well, first of all, that's what he calls the core commitment, and his use of this term, the core commitment, is just a con, because no one really believes it, because it's true. He said he would do everything to avoid a fifth election, but people more or less understood that he would use his influence to bring other right-wing parties aboard and not contradict his most solemn and oft-repeated pledge not to go with the anti-Zionist party, who, by the way, by law should be precluded from participating in the election anyway. But he never said, I will prevent a fifth election, even at the cost of going with Ryan, because if he did that, he wouldn't have got through the minimum threshold. So it's a clear case of deceit, and this core commitment, which is something we only heard of afterwards. Before it was clear to the voters of Yamina what the core commitment was. The core commitment was not to allow anti-Zionists into positions of power or influence. And if you look at post-election polling, it's quite clear. Over half of them feel that this was a breach of pre-election pledges. Over half of them think that it's wrong to give the Arab parties access to power, and over half of them said they would not vote for Naftali Bennett if they knew that he was going with the Arab parties, and most impressively, 60% said that they think it's wrong for the government to be dependent on the anti-Zionist Islamist list around. So if you look at the people who voted for him, they show clearly what they thought was the core commitment. Over half think it was a breach. Over half think that they wouldn't have voted for him if they knew that what he was going to do. And 60% think that the present situation is inappropriate. So, Naftali Bennett can tell us from here to tomorrow that that's what he really meant, but no one believes it, certainly not his own voters.
So you mentioned before that, and again, going back to your exact quote, in a single act of rash, duplicity, and deceit, Naftali Bennett provided the left with a plum prize from which it has been precluded for years, broad access to positions of government control and influence. What is so dangerous about that, considering that Naftali Bennett is telling the electorate, this government is going to be it's right and left, and we differ on so many issues, core issues. We're just going to be focused on what we agree upon. And therefore, don't be afraid about this government, because we're only going to focus on what we agree upon. They can veto, the left can veto our right-wing issues. The right will veto their left-wing issues. We're just going to focus on the sterile issues dealing with Israeli society and infrastructure, etc. So it sounds like there shouldn't be anything to be scared about. Why do you feel that it's dangerous that the left are now in power with budgets and decision-making, understanding that context?
Well, in Israeli reality, the government doesn't really have much control over what forces its way onto the agenda. And you've got a prime example now with the new decision about extending the ban on unification of Palestinian families. Now, I'm not quite sure what the outcome will be, but that's not a left or right issue. And not always the government can focus only on issues which are not left or not right or have some leaning one way or the other, because there's been nothing
just to give some people context before you continue, and it's very important, just to give some people context, this is a law on the books that has to be renewed every year because of the Supreme Court got involved, which basically forbids it's basically the infiltration of Arabs from Judea and Samaria into Israel proper to get Israeli citizenship just by marrying Arabs who live in Israel. It's basically a demographic ticking time bomb that all Zionist parties support because they know it's a demographic ticking time bomb and an existential threat to Israel. But obviously the Arab Muslim parties are against it, and even the Meretz, the far left Meretz party, is against it. And Naftali Bennett can't pass it in his government because Meretz and the Arab Muslim party are against it. So here, his government is not able to even to pass something that the right and center parties agree upon. So continue.
Yeah, so but there could be other things, like, for instance, the need to initiate a large-scale operation in Gaza, and the decision about how large it should be, how long it should take. All these are issues which there is unlikely to be any sort of consensus within the current coalition. There might be other things like building across the 1967 Green Lines, or investing in infrastructure, which many left-wing ministers may have a say in it. For instance, in transport, are you going to develop roads or infrastructure that increases the safety of Jewish inhabitants there? Well, what's going to happen? Basically, in Israel, nearly every issue that you can think of on the agenda is somehow
ideological.
All right. So somehow partisan. I mean, even take the issue of, if the Biden administration tries to roll back some of the favorable moves made by Trump, which way is the government going to go? What's going to be? I mean, you must remember that the Bennett coalition, apart from Ram, only got 55? Or the 60 minus 4, 50? Yeah, 55 votes, well below a majority. So it's in a very shaky condition. It's totally dependent on the Ram party, and of course the Meretz party, who in many ideological issues are not far apart. So saying that we will only deal with the commonalities, it's not just what kind of paving for the sidewalks we should have, and building restrictions in Tel Aviv. There are many other issues, and nearly everyone has a partisan flavor to it.
Now, I want to go back to your article, where the title of your article is Naftali Goldfarb or Gonen Bennett, and I'll let you give that context. But it's basically referring to another political constellation where right-wingers were voted in and ended up turning on their right-wing voter base and joining the left and allowing disaster to take by joining the left in a government. And the second time that happened is Ariel Sharon as well. Promised not be against the left-wing ideological agenda to uproot Jewish communities, expel Jews from their homes in Judea and Samaria or Gaza, and then he becomes prime minister and he totally goes against his ideological position for decades and against his own promises to his electorate, and then turns left. And now we have today. The concern is how can right-wingers continue to be trusting of our right-wing politicians if now we're talking about the third time that our political leaders who promised to be right-wing leaders are allowing the left to get into power and potentially endanger the state of Israel and go against most, if not all, of their previous ideological positions and even electoral promises.
Yeah, well, I agree with you. This is a real crisis of confidence for the Israeli electorate and the democratic process here. If you remember, and probably even worse, because here what you have is one of the smallest factions in the leading coalition, basically taking the coalition into power and against all its electoral promises. The two instances we talked about before, with Gonen Segev and Alex Goldfarb, if listeners remember, these were two members of parliament who were elected into the parliament on behalf of a very hawkish right-wing party called Somet, headed by the former chief of staff of the IDF. And once they were in power and the Oslo process began, the Oslo process was implemented in two stages. The first stage was in 1993, where they signed a broad agreement with the PLO and Yasser Arafat over a declaration of principles. And then 2 years later, by the way, the first round they didn't support the Oslo agreements. The second round in 1995, Gonen Segev and Alex Goldfarb crossed the party lines, joined the Rabin government, who had signed this unprecedented the concessionary agreement, and were appointed minister and deputy minister as a result of that. The agreement passed again by a very slim margin, 61 to 59. So the vote hinged on the defection of these two right-wing parties, and it brought about the
two right-wing politicians.
Yeah, and they brought about this horrendous process of death and destruction and tragedy and trauma to both sides as a result of this defection. The other incident that you remembered was Arik Sharon, who during the election campaign specifically opposed unilateral withdrawal from Gaza, and which was opposed by his Labour Party rival Amram Mitzna. Yet when he got into power, he recanted on all his electoral pledges and implemented exactly what he promised not to. And the result is clear. Today, Gaza has descended into a huge strategic threat to Israel, which can close down our airport, can put hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Israelis in shelters for weeks on end. And in both cases, these very calamitous outcomes were the result of a right-wing defection to abandon the electoral pledges and embrace a dovish concessionary policy. So,
Martin, we lost you for a second. Just take it back a sentence. Start again.
I say in all cases, these calamitous consequences came about because right-wing politicians abandoned their electoral pledges and embraced a dovish concessionary policy, which up until then was unprecedented. And in both cases, I say they resulted in death and destruction both for Arabs and Israelis. In fact, in many ways, the Arabs have suffered more of the consequences than the Israeli Jews have. So perhaps in many respects, the worst enemies the Palestinian Arabs have are the left-wing so-called supporters in the Israeli polity.
Before we end, any positive outlook about this political situation we're in right now, Martin?
Well, the only positive bit of news that I can think of, or positive prospect that I can think of, is that it's such a fractious government with such impossible internal contradictions that it hasn't got much prospect of enduring for long, and that it might just implode because of its own imbalances in a very short time. And of course, I think the faster we get rid of it, the better it will be for the people of Israel.
Now, I'm just going to play devil's advocate on that point, because on the other hand, the two right-wing parties that are enabling this government, which is Naftali Bennett, Prime Minister Naftali Bennett's Yamina party, and Gideon Sa'ar's New Hope party, well, if it does fall apart and as quickly as possible, well, they're left with no voter base, and therefore it's in their best interests to allow this to take place, no matter how much they're going to be extorted by the left for whatever votes and whatever issues to keep this government afloat.
That's true, but I think in the final analysis, public pressure will and the inability to function will bring about an additional election, which, by the way, Bennett was trying to avoid. So I think basically there's Hebrew saying, something about someone who was kicked out of the town and had to eat rotten fish. But both of them, I think Bennett will end up with the same, not preventing election and being booted out of the Israeli political system. Because if Bennett today were to, I mean, just shows you know how inappropriate his claim about a core commitment is. If Bennett today went to the polls, he wouldn't make it into the Knesset. So I think in the end, the pressure of public dissatisfaction and the inability of the government to function will bring about new elections anyway.
Do you see any constellation, again, reminding everybody that the Shakespearean tragedy in this situation is, for the first time, we actually have 65 right-wing seats to be able to have a right-wing coalition, and it's Naftali Bennett and Gideon Sa'ar who did not allow that, and they joined the left instead of allowing for a right-wing coalition. Do you see any constellation with them two parties finally saying, okay, enough's enough, we can't deal with this extortion anymore, we're going to join the right and set up a government with 65 without having to go to new elections?
Again, then I'm a little skeptical, because what they've shown is that their personal animosity towards Netanyahu is so great that it blurs the vision of the national interest. You know, something like that eventually may come, but I think there'll probably be such bad blood around that I don't know how cohesive such a coalition will be. I think that's probably the most probable outcome is that they will not get into the next Knesset because of the situation they've created, and I think that would be basically a justifiable just a justifiable outcome, where people who've been so dishonest and so duplicitous need to be punished.
Just interestingly, following this train of thought, there is the theory that part of what they tried to do is, and by forming this government, is by forcing the Likud to get rid of Netanyahu, to then allow someone else in the Likud to take over, and then be able to join the Likud and a right-wing government. And I think they kept on thinking, well, the more we push to the left, and the more Likud will push to get rid of Netanyahu. Well, as we're seeing, Likud is not getting rid of Netanyahu. He's still there. And I guess the question is, are they going to continue going down this path of being extorted by the left and endangering Israel's national security interest, which they know and they themselves warned against for years, and finally say, okay, they're not getting rid of Netanyahu, we can't do this anymore. Let's finally join Likud and stop this horrible process government that we ourselves started, which wasn't about trying to get rid of Netanyahu.
Yeah, well, I don't know how far that will go. I mean, I'm not quite sure how much bad blood there is on both sides. But basically what you've been describing is an attempt by parties whose internal workings are not democratic to try and coerce a party whose internal workings are democratic to determine who should and who shouldn't be at the head of that party. You know, if you want to decide who should and who shouldn't be head of the party, join the party and vote for any candidate you want. But what happened now is that neither of them have done that, and Gideon Sa'ar, in fact, has challenged Netanyahu twice, one from inside, one from outside, and in both cases, it's been anything but a spectacular success. You know, I don't think that there's going to be much willingness to re-embrace Gideon Sa'ar and somehow embrace Naftali Bennett. You know, Naftali Bennett seems to be a man of great talent and little judgment, because basically what he's done now, I think he's basically ended his political career that he worked so hard to build up. You know, if you think about how outrageous it is, that one of the smallest factions in the ruling coalition is now head of the coalition. I mean, there's no other word but just for unmitigated extortion. There's no ways that he's head of the government because of Vox Populi, because of the voice of the people. If anything, the people voted against him and voted against Sa'ar.
Right,
and not in a level playing field. because the mainstream media and much of the elites were very sympathetic towards them. So with all this on their side, they still come up with miserable results. But between them, they hardly managed to get 10% of the electorate, and yet they're there. You're making decisions which affect the lives of all of us. It's just not democratic.
Right. And I was just to give context for people who are not familiar, when you were referring to the Likud having a democratic process and the two other parties that are trying to have Likud dethrone Netanyahu, Yamina, Gideon Sa'ar's New Hope Party, and Naftali Bennett, the Yamina Party, both of those parties, they do not have primaries. They basically made themselves leaders of their own parties. They weren't democratically elected, as opposed to the Likud. The Likud does have primaries, and Netanyahu was elected in a democratic process. So how sadly ironic that here they're trying to force a party with a democratic choosing a leader, and they themselves not only are not democratically elected into their own parties, but both of them put themselves up against Netanyahu and lost in the democratic process, and yet here they're trying to do everything for the Likud to dethrone Netanyahu.
By the way, the same is true for Yair Lapid's party. Yair Lapid
right, is also not democratically elected, no primary.
And if you look at another quote that I brought in the article, Lapid himself scoffed at Netanyahu's claim that he would bring vaccines by January, and they said that there's no way, we'll be last in line, everyone else is ahead of us, and which shows what sort of wisdom and foresight Yair Lapid has. And this is the man that Naftali Bennett wants to replace Netanyahu and replace himself later. And the guy's proved that he's got no sense of what's going on. He doesn't foresee events. He doesn't know. And these are the three people, Sal, Bennett, and Bennett and Bennett, who are basically leading the nation in this very, very difficult time. Are they going to stand up to an American administration like Biden's? Are they going to be able to deal with the Iranian threat? But, it's not that Netanyahu has been a total failure as prime minister. He's had transformational successes. If you look at Israel when Netanyahu came into power, and you look at Israel today, for all the criticisms I have of Netanyahu, I'm not an uncritical apologist for Netanyahu. I don't think he's handled the crime in the Arab sector well. I don't think he's handled the Negev well. I don't think he's handled Israel's public diplomacy well. And the judiciary system, it should have pushed for more sort of reforms. But he certainly had great success. He's transformed Israel in many aspects. He's broadened its diplomatic reach. One of the few things that he doesn't get credit for is basically putting a wedge into the European Union by forming warm relations with Central and Eastern European countries in the EU, which basically guarantee that there can't be a vote of sanctions against Israel because the vote needs to be unanimous, and it won't be unanimous with the Visegrad.
Right. And it's important, because since you mentioned that, it's important to mention Lapid, who is today's Israel's foreign minister, was against Netanyahu's policy of becoming friendly and generating closer relations with the Central and Eastern European countries. So if he implements that ideology that he was vocal about over the years against Netanyahu, and he implements that as foreign minister, that means Israel might be losing out on our current friends from Central and Eastern Europe in international forums.
So now you understand why I said I was apprehensive about what was going to happen. You asked me the first question in the opening of the interview.
Oh, I know the answers myself. I want the audience to hear your insight about those issues.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. Well, going back to your we'll end with your optimistic tone that since this the optimistic point that since this is a government that really has nothing that brings it together, except for the hatred of Netanyahu and wanting to get rid of Netanyahu, and understanding that there is no vacuum in politics, even though they say they're not going to deal with ideological issues. Ideological issues are going to be popping up every day, bringing up tension in this government. So the optimistic point you mentioned is hopefully sooner than later, this government, which is so dangerous in many ways, will fall. Anything else you want to add, Martin?
Well, I think we've covered most of the points, and thank you for a comprehensive interview.
Martin, it is always a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time, and keep up the great work you're doing.
Thank you.
All right. Everybody, I hope you enjoyed today's interview with Martin Sherman. Very, very important topic. Again, I like to tell you, even I'm here putting out the information and what I believe to be the truth about the situation in Israel that our mainstream media, global mainstream media, Israeli mainstream media, and Jewish mainstream media ignore, because ideologically they are on board with getting rid of Netanyahu, unfortunately. But as a believing Jew, I do believe things in the end will work out. Things might get worse before they get better. We're here to call out the problems and raise the issues so that we're vocal about it. Each and every one of us can make a difference, first of all, by hearing the truth and sharing the truth and educating more people about the truth. But in the end, don't get depressed. We are the most blessed generation of Jews ever to be sovereign in our homeland once again. Sometimes we have good governments, sometimes we have bad governments, sometimes we have good prime ministers, sometimes we have bad prime ministers. Our future is up to us, the little people. It's not always our politicians or governments, even though they do make unbelievably important decisions that affect our lives. Stay positive, make a difference, and we will all see good times ahead. Thank everyone for watching. If you are not yet a subscriber to Pulse of Israel, go to pulseofisrael.com and sign up for our video newsletter to get the truth from a voice of Judea and Samaria that does not get across by other media, as I just explained before. Signing off from the eternal and ancestral homeland, this is Avi Abelo for another episode of the Pulse of Israel. Thanks for watching, everyone. Shalom.
Pulse of Israel, frontline videos from the Holy Land. Support our work by donating today.